Hi, in this lecture, you're going to learn more about the pancreas. Now, the pancreas is a deep organ. You can see it back there. You kind of have to pull the stomach out of the way to see it, but it has an exocrine and an endocrine function. Now, the exocrine function, remember, exocrine is secreting through a duct, and the exocrine function is really involved in making digestive enzymes. So the bulk of the pancreas, 99% of it, are all these cells here called Acini cells or acinar cells, and they make enzymes to break down all of your food. Critical for that. We're going to focus on the endocrine function. The endocrine function is to make hormones. And so what you'll notice is there's these scattered pockets of cells. They usually stay in a lighter color, like little islands. They're called islets of Langerhans, or just call them pancreatic islets. So these are the little clusters of cells that are going to make the hormones. And you probably already know that the hormones made by the pancreas are glucagon and insulin. Now there's some other hormones. The main ones we focus on are glucagon and insulin. So there's alpha cells that make the glucagon, and then the beta cells make the insulin. And so we know that we have homeostasis, basically what we're trying to maintain our blood glucose level. So I'm going to give you a bigger range because some books will say 70 to 110 and some will say 80 to 120. So we're going to go with 70 to 120 milligrams per deciliter for a typical blood glucose level. And as you can see, these hormones are antagonistic hormones. They're going to have opposite effects. So when you eat a meal, so you have a snack and you sit down to do your anatomy, you eat, your blood glucose levels start to go up, right? So they go above 120. As they go up, that's the trigger for those beta cells to release insulin. So it's a humoral stimulus. Insulin is released, and then it's going to lower your blood glucose levels, bring them back down where it's supposed to be. One way is basically unlocking these glucose channels or these glucose transporters so you can increase glucose into your cells. So it's going to go in your cells, and then your glucose level comes down. Now, you haven't eaten a meal, your glucose levels start to fall. So if it's been a couple hours since you've eaten, you might be feeling a little tired right now, and I might be making you hungry, reminding you that you haven't eaten, so I apologize for that. But your glucose levels are falling. And as they fall, the alpha cells will sense that it's dropping below 70 and release glucagon. Now, glucagon's job is to bring your blood glucose levels back up again. So it's going to take it out of storage. So when we store glucose as glycogen, we're going to try to break it down back into glucose so we can release it. So glucagon is a catabolic hormone because it's going to be breaking down our reserves to get glucose, whereas insulin is an anabolic hormone because it is putting glucose in our cells, and in fact, we're going to store excess glucose as glycogen. So let's look at this in more detail. So they're both protein hormones because they do not come from the adrenal cortex nor the gonads. As we said, glucagon is a catabolic hormone. So it's stimulated when your blood glucose levels fall. So you haven't eaten a meal, blood glucose levels are dropping. That's the stimulus. Alpha cells release the glucagon, and glucagon's job is to bring your blood glucose back up again. So it's responding to blood sugar or blood glucose. So that's why it's a humoral stimulus. It needs to bring them back up. So where do you get glucose from if you haven't eaten it? Well, the first thing you do is you take it from glycogen. So you're going to take your glycogen and you're going to break it down because remember that glycogen is the storage form of glucose. So you're going to do glycogenolysis. So my glycogen gets broken down into glucose. You see that lyse word on that. That means to break it down. And this primarily happens in the liver. It also will break down fat. That's called lipolysis. Now, it's going to take your fat and break it down so that your cells will use fats, but it also will convert glycerol. You might remember that a triglyceride is a glycerol, right? And fatty acids. You can convert glycerol into glucose. And that is the really big long word. That is called gluconeogenesis. So genesis formation of new glucose. And we can do that from glycerol. We can also do it from amino acids. So you're going to break down protein to release amino acids to make glucose. You're going to break down your fat and burn fat for energy and convert it into glucose. And so the ultimate job is you release the glucose into your blood, and your blood glucose levels are going to go up. Now, one thing I want to mention really quick is that when we take fat and we break fat down for energy, if we do that at a very fast rate, we form things called ketone bodies or ketones. You would have learned about this back in Bio 119. As far as they're produced, they're acids. And the issue is that these acids, these ketones, are made as a byproduct of when you're breaking down lipids quickly. And then they go to your kidney and you pee them out in your urine. So you can test your ketone strip in your urine. And we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about those ketones when we talk about diabetes mellitus. And lastly, if you've ever heard of the term hypoglycemia, the individual might be deficient in glucagon. See, glucagon's job is to increase your blood glucose levels, so it's a hyperglycemic hormone. So if your blood glucose levels always stay low, then you probably have trouble with glucagon because you can't raise them. Whereas insulin, on the other hand, is a protein hormone. It's anabolic. Humoral stimulus for release. It's released anytime there's an increase in your blood glucose level. And then it would be inhibited if they were to fall. So again, we have another humoral stimulus. And its job is when blood glucose levels go up, it needs to bring them back down. So it's a hypoglycemic hormone because it's going to lower your blood glucose levels. So it's anabolic. Well, the number one thing it does is it increases glucose transport into your cells. It basically opens a little glucose transporter. It's the key that opens it, and now glucose can leave your blood and go inside your cell. When it gets inside your cells, it's used to make ATP. So it helps us burn glucose for energy. Now, any extra glucose is going to get converted into glycogen. So remember, now we're forming glycogen. So that's glycogenesis. That's when we take extra glucose and we convert it and store it as glycogen. And you probably remember that we store glycogen in two places. Do you remember where they are? The liver and skeletal muscle is where that's all going to be stored. So it also, if there's any extra glucose, it can convert any extra glucose into fat. So this is called lipogenesis, making lipids. And the liver will do that, and then a lot of times it'll get stored out in your adipose tissue. It also helps with just making fat in general. Any triglycerides that you ate in your meal will get stored as fat. So insulin is a fat store hormone, and it helps with protein synthesis as well. So this is a picture from your book, just trying to go over the two hormones so you can see their effects and what's happening. And so we have the response with insulin. If our blood glucose levels were to increase, then we know that the beta cells are going to sense that. They're going to release insulin and it brings it down. And if our blood glucose levels would fall, we have the alpha cells and they release glucagon, and its job is to break it out of storage. So I know you've heard of diabetes mellitus. Now remember, there's diabetes insipidus, that's ADH. Diabetes mellitus has to do with insulin and blood glucose or blood sugar. Now it's called diabetes mellitus because mel is Latin for sweet. So the story I've heard is years ago, before they had the really nice little test strips for blood glucose, if you had a large urine output, because there's diabetes insipidus where you don't have ADH, so you pee a lot, and there's diabetes mellitus, which also makes you pee a lot. It's called polyuria. That you would have this watery urine. And the way they could tell if it was diabetes mellitus or insipidus was to taste it. You think your job is bad, at least you don't have to taste urine. So they would taste it, and if it was sweet because it had glucose in it, so they knew it was diabetes mellitus. I don't know, I was told that was true. So there's two types. There's type 1 and type 2. So type 1 is often called insulin dependent. It used to be called juvenile onset because it tends to strike suddenly and in younger individuals, but the pancreas stops making it. It's just not making insulin. Whereas type 2 is sometimes called adult onset. But what happens in type 2 is that the pancreas makes insulin, but it's like a bad form of insulin. Like the cells don't respond to it. So it seems to be more like a receptor cell insensitivity. And so if we were just to kind of compare and contrast the two of these, type 1 diabetes, you don't make insulin. It usually starts during childhood, and usually have a family history. So it can be an autoimmune disease where the immune system attacks the beta cells. Type 2, your body makes insulin. The pancreas makes it, but it's not working really well. This is more common in older individuals. And some risk factors here are obesity, family history as well. You can see some of the signs and symptoms are pretty close for the same because you have high blood glucose levels. We'll look at that in just a minute. You can prevent type 2 with diet and lifestyle to some extent. You can't really prevent type 1. Type 1, they're on insulin. They probably have an insulin pump that they wear so it can automatically sample the insulin, sample the blood glucose, and automatically release insulin. Because see, when you exercise works just like insulin. It lowers your blood glucose. It helps your cells take it in. So if you take insulin and you exercise, your blood glucose levels might crash. But a lot of these insulin pumps are just constantly checking it, and they can make sure that they deliver just the right amount. Someone with type 2 might not need to be on insulin. A lot of times they go on a form of insulin later if their body won't respond. So causes, genetics, right? You didn't get to pick your parents. So definitely family history for both of these. They tend to run in families. Obesity and lack of exercise is primarily a cause for type 2. In fact, changing your diet, eating more fiber, eating foods that are low on what's called the glycemic index, lower sugary foods can help. Autoimmune disease, definitely type 1, where the immune system can attack those beta cells. Type 2, I've seen evidence, possibly, maybe not. I think the jury's still out on that. And then receptor cell insensitivity is classic for type 2. So, if you have a horrible diet and you're always eating sugary foods and your blood glucose level keeps spiking, every time your blood glucose level goes up, so does your insulin. And then over time, you're chronically elevating insulin and insulin and insulin, and your cells just start to ignore it. If you have kids, or you all have a mother, I'm sure, if you know how we nag. So if you didn't do something, and I'll just pick on my family, like, hey, clean up your socks. Well, maybe the first time I say that, my kid listens to me, but then he starts to tune me out, right? So I'm like, hey, clean up your socks, and he ignores me. I'm like, hey, clean up your socks, and he ignores me. And I have to keep yelling and yelling and yelling. Well, he has receptor cell insensitivity to his mother's voice. But that's kind of what happens in your body, and it doesn't respond well to insulin. So sometimes you might go on insulin, and it might respond a little better to that, like dad's voice or another voice. But that's kind of the idea for this. Now, other treatments, for type 1, they're looking at beta cell transfers. They're trying to look at some bioengineering to try to make a liver cell work like a beta cell. So it's kind of interesting where that might be going. So signs and symptoms, how do you know you might have it? Well, you're going to have extra glucose in your blood, so it spills over into your urine. So you'll have that sugary urine we talked about. Because you can't use the glucose for energy, your cells are starving. See, that glucose won't get in the cell. So the cells really want to eat. You're going to feel hungry a lot because they think they're starving because they can't use it. So what happens is your body starts to burn fat for fuel. And then that makes a byproduct called ketones, which I just talked about. But when these ketones get up into your lungs, they actually form like an acetone vapor. So your breath might have like a fruity smell to it. And if they accumulate, their acids, they can put you in a coma and they can kill you. So the ketones go to your kidney and you urinate them out. You'll have polyuria. The glucose increases the urine output, so you're going to have frequent urination. You might get up a couple times during the night to pee. Because you're urinating so much, you're probably going to be thirsty a lot, so polydipsia. You might feel tired because your cells aren't able to use the glucose as well. And you might feel hungry a lot because your cells are basically starving. So very basically, if we're looking at this cycle of the diabetes, we know that what's happening is these ketones. So it's called ketoacidosis, or you'll hear it called DKA for diabetic ketoacidosis. It is a life-threatening condition that can happen. And so when you don't have insulin and you're not able to use the glucose, the liver is trying to produce glucose from fats, and your cells are switching over and burning more fats. So as you start to break these fats down and burn them, you start to make all these ketones. Well, these ketones are a byproduct, and they go to your kidney where you eliminate them. Well, if you're making them faster than you can eliminate them, they're going to accumulate in your blood, and then they can cause ketoacidosis. And again, that can be fatal. It's a pretty severe condition. What are some long-term effects of having diabetes mellitus? So this is more like untreated or uncontrolled diabetes mellitus. You basically have this extra glucose in your blood, and it's an irritant. So we know it affects the retina of the eyes. It affects small capillaries. So it can cause blindness to occur. Sometimes you'll get a growth of capillaries over the eye, and they go in and they laser that off. We know it definitely affects the kidneys. Nephropathy, we're looking at kidney function, right? It's going to affect having to process all that glucose. We know it causes neuropathy. You can have issues with your nerves and your nerves functioning properly. You might get tingling or numbness in your feet. You might have a wound and then you don't feel it as well. And then the problem is, if you have a wound and you don't know it's there, you're not going to keep it clean and you're not going to keep it bandaged. So you're more likely for that wound to start to get gangrene and then have to have an amputation. And then we also know it increases our risk of cardiovascular disease, right? CVD. That we know it increases your risk of having a heart attack or having a stroke. So there's a lot of problems, a lot of health problems with your untreated or uncontrolled diabetes mellitus. So this finishes our lecture on the pancreas.